Hi, I'm Jack Baker. This presentation is going to focus on work from my research group at Stanford to assess seismic risk to transportation networks. It's going to focus on user impacts and at-risk communities as a target objective of the analysis, and it's going to use a fully probabilistic seismic risk analysis framework. I'll mention at the outset that this work borrows primarily from Mahalia Miller's PhD thesis, but also relies on work from a number of other group members here at Stanford, Samuel Cortez, Nirmal Jairam, Maria Markvita, and Jason Wu, and also benefited greatly from the collaboration of Dave Ory and Tom Shantz. Okay, so the motivation for this work and this presentation is that we wanted to take our analysis beyond just engineering evaluation. We're generally, as engineers, good at thinking about physical damage to structures, but it's really the services that infrastructure provides that were ultimately of interest to society, and maintaining those services after a disaster should be our ultimate objective of a risk analysis. So taking our analysis down to user impacts is important, and the other complication of these analyses that we wanted to think about and advance is that when we're thinking about regional level infrastructure, it's quite likely that in a big event, like a large earthquake, that we're going to see simultaneous damage to multiple components of that infrastructure system. And modeling that simultaneous damage and understanding its impacts, for example, as it takes away redundant routes in a transportation network, that's a challenging problem, but one that we felt we could make some progress on. So what I'm going to talk about in this presentation is first to discuss a framework for analyzing user risks in a transportation system like this. We're going to use the San Francisco Bay Area network as an example. And then we're going to utilize that framework to identify at-risk communities, and I'll discuss a little bit about some of our current thoughts on identifying critical infrastructure components. Okay, so this case study, we'll use a real-world example to kind of motivate some of our analysis and demonstrate its feasibility on a large infrastructure network problem. So here's just an aerial photograph of the San Francisco Bay Area. The Bay Area refers to the 8 counties that touch the San Francisco Bay here. The major urban centers of San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose are certainly important, each with populations in the neighborhood of 1 million. The overall region has a population of about 7 million people, so a very large system. I should also note the distance from San Francisco to San Jose is on the order of 80 kilometers, so it's a large, geographically spread out urban area. And then what also makes things complicated is that we've got a number of active faults. It's a highly seismically active region of the world, in particular the San Andreas Fault and the Hayward Fault. Here I've highlighted in white. There's a number of other locations with red lines marking additional active faults in the area. So you'll note there's these faults crossing all over in the area of the urban region. In particular, these faults, the Hayward and the San Andreas, travel right along the edges of the urban extent here, and in fact many of our transportation corridors move right along those faults as well. So significant exposure of transportation network assets to ground shaking and other effects from earthquakes that will occur on these faults in the future. We've had a couple famous experiences with earthquakes in this region, notably the 1906 San Francisco earthquake that caused widespread destruction, but our infrastructure systems at the time were nothing like they are today. A little more modern experience is the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. This San Francisco Bay Area is noted in blue here. You can see this red star down to the south marks the epicenter of the Loma Prieta earthquake. That was a 6.9 earthquake. It's notably about a unit smaller in moment magnitude than the 1906 earthquake. It was also about 95 kilometers south of San Francisco. The color shading here indicates the intensity of shaking intensity throughout the region. And you can see that both the earthquake was located far away from San Francisco and some of the northern parts of the Bay Area, and also that the strongest shaking occurred kind of to the south of the urban region. Despite this, there was widespread impact. A couple notable damaging situations was that the I-880 viaduct in the Eastern Bay collapsed. That killed 42 people. The San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge, that's noted in the lower figure here, had a partial collapse. At one point, that bridge itself was closed for a month. And this is one of the busiest bridges in the United States in terms of traffic carried. And then this collapse necessitated a reevaluation and actually a construction of a replacement bridge. We'll talk about in just a second. These were the 2 highest profile failures. There's numerous other freeway sections that were closed. And this experience, combined with the 1994 Northridge earthquake, in Southern California spurred a massive statewide retrofit effort to upgrade these transportation systems, and notably the bridges, which are known as weak links in the system, or vulnerable to shaking at least. Okay, so we're going to look at the transportation model as it exists today with a very high fidelity model here. So I've got plotted over on the right the locations of the roads in this transportation model. So there's a total of 32,000 road segments in this model spanning this Bay Area, and then we have a model for transit users who would like to get from point A to point B, and they have on the order of 20 million trips a day on this network. So a very large network with a large number of trips that need to take place for users to have their demand satisfied. In addition, there's a number of other modes of transportation that can be used that are included in the model. So there's anything from walking and biking trips to mass transit rail systems, ferries and buses, and so on. There's another 4 million trips per day that take place on those. Shown here on the right are the major rail systems in the area. There's a few different types of light rail and heavy rail that also span quite a geographic extent. And then finally, here's a plot of the bus routes throughout the region that covers many of the roads in the road network. Okay, so just to give you kind of a quick snapshot that this is a large and detailed model for transportation in the area. Okay, so what are we going to do to analyze the impacts to that transportation system? It's a 4-stage analysis approach. Let me give you a quick overview here, and then we'll talk in more detail about each step. So the first step of the analysis is going to be to predict ground motion intensity from a future earthquake event. So this is going to be strength of shaking that will then cause impacts to the system. It's going to be spatially variable, and it's going to vary depending on the particular earthquake scenario that we hypothesize. Once we predict ground motion intensity for an earthquake event, we're going to simulate component damage in step 2. So this, we're going to be thinking about damage to bridges from ground shaking. There are certainly other mechanisms by which the road network could be disrupted, but shaking damage to bridges is a primary one in this situation, and so that'll be our focus here. And then once we predict the damage to the bridges, we're going to look at how that bridge damage impacts the network in terms of flow capacity on given links and the travel time increases that reduced capacity implies. And then once we have a model for the kind of reduced traffic capacity and increased travel times, we're going to study how that impacts the users of the network geographically, and I'll explain that further in a moment. So let's back up to step 1. So we want to think about ground motion intensity, and we don't want to consider just a single scenario earthquake without considering its likelihood. So what we do is we consider kind of the full suite of possible earthquakes in the region, and that includes kind of a range of faults on which those earthquakes occur. Here shown in black is maps of surface projections of all the faults in the region. Each of those faults can produce earthquakes of varying magnitudes, so we range from as small as 5, thinking about that being the smallest earthquake of engineering importance for us, up to as large of a magnitude as the fault can produce, up to the neighborhood of magnitude 8 for the San Andreas northern segment here. And then the locations on those faults are also going to be variable, and so those are randomized. When we discretize kind of that full set of scenarios, we end up with 2,800 possible earthquake rupture scenarios in this case, and each of those has an annual rate of occurrence as well. So some of these events are going to be more likely than others. And then when we have that full suite of scenarios with each having an annual rate of occurrence, we can kind of propagate those annual rates through to the impacts, and that'll facilitate cost-benefit decision making. It's not just going to be impacts conditional on a scenario, but it's actually, we can compute things like annual impacts or the annual likelihood of exceeding some level of impact. Okay. So this whole model for earthquake occurrences, we're just using the Uniform California Earthquake Rupture Forecast, version 2 model. So that exactly specifies all these inputs that we need. And then further, there's a helpful software tool at opensha.org that's this event set simulator, and it'll generate these whole set of 2,800 ruptures with some, as long as the user specifies the appropriate parameters for the analysis. So we're utilizing OpenSHA and this so-called USERF forecast to specify all these earthquake ruptures. Then, so we've got a specification of the earthquake ruptures in terms of the locations and the size of the earthquakes. The other thing we need to predict ground motion intensity is an estimate of site conditions, so that near surface soil that can potentially amplify shaking. So we're going to use average shear wave velocity over the top 30 meters of the site as a way to characterize site condition. So when that shear wave velocity is low, That's indicating the presence of softer soils that may amplify ground shaking. Ideally, we would measure that average shear wave velocity directly, but when we're looking at a very large spatial extent like this, that's not possible. So what we've done is to infer those so-called VS30 values from topographic slope. So places with steeper slopes are generally known to be associated with rock conditions or stiffer soil conditions, and flatter topography is indicated, often indicating sedimentary basins where we have soft superficial soils. So we're using the model of Wald and Allen to infer these VS30 values. Over on the right, I've shown just in color the red values indicating lower average shear wave velocities, where we would anticipate more ground motion amplification. Okay. And now that we've got the parameterization of the earthquake scenarios and the soil conditions, we can simulate or predict ground motions. So here over on this left pane, we've got an illustration of a median ground motion prediction. So the black line moving from northwest to southeast is one of our earthquake scenarios here at northern San Andreas fault rupture. And we've got a magnitude associated with it. For every point in this map, we know the source to site distance, how far away from this earthquake rupture we are. And we have site conditions from this previous slide, the inferences. So those are the inputs needed for an empirical ground motion prediction equation to predict a median ground motion intensity. And you can see the intensities moving from red indicating a high intensity and close to the fault, heading towards a more yellow color at distance, but also some impact of topography reflecting those site conditions. But so we have these ground motion prediction equations, but we know that there's a lot of variability around those predictions when we go look at real earthquakes. And so we want to capture that variability in our forward simulations as well. So we're going to add to this median prediction amplitude variability in our shaking, and that's going to either increase or decrease those predictions in a random way that we'll simulate with Monte Carlo simulation. But we also know that amplitude variability is spatially correlated. So if you have a higher than expected ground motion at one site, adjacent sites are likely to also have higher than expected amplitudes. So we'll simulate a spatially correlated random field here to reflect that variability. And we'll put those, the median prediction with the variability together to get a simulation of ground shaking amplitude. Here we're going to measure ground shaking amplitude using a 1 second spectral acceleration, because that'll be the input to our damage predictions that we'll see in just a moment. And I'll note that the paper down in the bottom right corner provides some additional details about these simulation steps. I'm clearly going at a very high level with this explanation here, just to think about schematically what's going on in the calculation. Okay, so we've got in this slide here, we've got an illustration visually of one realization of ground shaking intensity. We're going to do this for all 2,800 earthquake ruptures, and we can actually generate multiple realizations for each rupture as well, making multiple realizations of this amplitude variability, reflecting our uncertainty there. So we can generate kind of thousands of these maps of ground shaking amplitude throughout the region of interest. And then a final note here that the software to do this calculation, we have some tools available at our group website, stanford.edu/bakerjw/infrastructure.html. So this isn't something that has to be recoded from scratch for somebody interested in doing this. We can provide resources to automate this process. Okay, so we've now got ground shaking intensity, and we want to look at damage to components of the infrastructure system, which, as I noted, are going to be the bridges. That'll be the focus here. So here's a view from the ground of a typical highway overpass in California. We see hundreds or thousands of these types of bridges all over California. And each of these bridges has unique characteristics typically, but we're going to simplify that story down into a number of parameters like the year in which the bridge was built. That'll be indicative of the seismic design standards that were considered when it was designed. The number of spans of the bridge, whether the bridge has a skew to it and what that angle would be, how big are the seats that's associated with unseating of the bridge during shaking, and so on. Those properties are going to map into a Federal Highway Administration bridge class, of which there are 28 classes of bridges in there. And then each of those 28 classes of bridges is going to have a fragility function as specified by the Federal Emergency Management Agency through HAZAS. So that fragility function is going to indicate for some degree of damage. The x-axis is going to be using that ground shaking intensity, the spectral acceleration at 1 second that we just discussed on the previous slide. And the y-axis is going to indicate the probability of damage. So as the ground shaking intensity increases, the probability of damage goes up and this function will be unique to each of those 28 bridge classes, so that some bridges will have a higher probability than others of damage at the same level of ground shaking intensity. Okay? So we're taking a pretty rough cut at the bridge modeling here, at what could be modeled in a very detailed way. We're actually just going to aggregate these bridges down to one of these 28 classes and utilize that fragility function to predict its damage. So that's, again, a necessary approximation when you're doing a regional scale assessment like this and thinking about thousands of bridges. We can't build detailed finite element models of each bridge and think about all of the parameter uncertainties and things that would be necessary to build one of these fragility functions from scratch. Although we can do that in a targeted way later, as I'll discuss later. So there is this trade-off when we're looking at these kind of regional scale assessments of using an appropriate level of refinement in our analysis, that we can make the analysis tractable yet still informative. And that'll be a theme that'll come up a couple more times here in this presentation. Okay, so at this point we're through step 2. Step 1, we generated these realizations of ground shaking intensity. And then step 2, we're going to use those shaking intensity realizations as inputs to these fragility functions, and then we'll simulate with the appropriate probability from this fragility function whether each bridge was damaged or not. So here's an example in this map of red circles indicating bridges that were damaged, and the black circles indicating bridges that weren't damaged. So we have realizations of bridge damage out of this type of modeling. Okay, now we need to think about, if those bridges are damaged, what is the impact on the network? And so if a bridge is damaged, its ability to carry traffic on the overpass is compromised. Potentially the ability to carry traffic under an overpass would be compromised as well, depending on the degree of damage. And then the other thing that we notice that there are interdependencies between, say here on the right, we have a figure of an elevated highway coming into San Francisco with a local road passing underneath of it, and then also a rail line, one of the Caltrain rail lines, passing underneath of those elevated highways as well. And so depending on the degree of damage to the elevated highway, it could impact the ability of that local road or the Caltrain to carry traffic as well. And so we used field surveys going out and looking at these bridges, as well as aerial photographs, to identify these overpasses and which other transit links would be impacted by a severe damage to the overpass. Okay, and then in this transportation model, we have a total of about 1,700 road bridges that need to be considered and 1,400 transit bridges that need to be considered. A great number of those are elevated sections of the BART transportation system, but a lot of the transit systems have bridges to be considered. And then we have face an issue here of what's the purpose of our analysis. And through discussions with our collaborators at the transit agencies and at the California Department of Transportation, it was suggested that we would have informative results if we could predict performance of the network 1 week after an earthquake. And the thinking would be that in the first few days after an earthquake, bridges with minor damage would be impacted, but then within a week, the Caltrans felt they would be able to repair a lot of the minor damage and enable the bridges to be functional again. But bridges with major damage or kind of near collapse performance, it would take longer to repair those. And so at the 1 week post-earthquake, then we have kind of an interesting decision point in terms of impacts and recovery that would be useful to model here. So because of that, we've only looked at major damage to these bridges in this analysis, but that's something that could be generalized without severely disrupting this framework. So I'll mention that damage state we're going to consider. The other thing I'll note is that because of similarities in ground shaking intensity at adjacent locations, that means that it's likely that adjacent bridges will also be simultaneously damaged. So you can see, for instance, in this realization, kind of a lot of clustering of damaged bridges around Oakland and around San Francisco because of that effect. And so that obviously has an impact when we go look at the network analysis on network effects in the way that this damage causes impacts to users. So that's naturally carried through in a Monte Carlo approach like this. Okay, so at this point we've done ground motion simulations and we've done bridge damage simulations. That was all quite computationally easy. So the ground motion predictions are empirical, it just is evaluating equations. The bridge damage is also evaluating simple fragility functions, so there's no computational cost here so far. When we go to our network analysis, we're going to head into a domain where there's a significant computational cost associated with analysis, and we can't carry through these thousands of simulations that we've produced to date. So what we do is kind of take these thousands of simulations up to this point, and then we're going to select a subset of those realizations and recalibrate the occurrence rates so that we have a reduced set of ground motions and damage simulations that represent that fully that full probabilistic suite that we've produced so far. So let me give you a couple highlights of that. I'll note here there's a reference at the bottom to a paper that provides much more detail for those of you interested in digging into this a little deeper. So here's the way we're going to do this subset selection. We're going to use an optimization approach. It borrows extremely heavily from an approach proposed by Rachel Davidson and her colleagues at University of Delaware, and the comparisons are also elaborated on in this paper down below. But the general idea would be that we've got at each location in this study region, so if we take this map down in the lower left, we've got a location with this red dot, so that's an example location. And if I look at the suite of thousands of simulated ground motions, we can produce a plot like up in the upper left. So we have a ground shaking intensity on the x-axis, that spectral acceleration at 1 second. And if we pick an amplitude like a half g, we could count up how many of these simulated maps produced ground shaking intensity greater than a half g at that particular location. And then the occurrence rates of all those simulations that produce greater than a half g, we could add them up. And then we could say, it's on the order of 10 to the minus 3 per year that I would see an earthquake that produced a half g ground shaking intensity at this site. So, and then if I fill that calculation in for a range of amplitudes, we get a curve that looks like this. This is actually exactly the same thing as a ground motion hazard curve you get from traditional probabilistic seismic hazard analysis. It's just Monte Carlo simulation based. And so this is using thousands of simulations. Okay, there's an illustration. So we're going to do something similar looking at the network performance, in this case the bridge damage. So in each of these simulations, we can count up how many bridges were damaged. And then if I want to take, say, how often did I see 60 bridges damaged, I could just go count up all the simulations where I saw 60 or more damaged bridges, add those all up, and I'll see on something a little less than 10 to the minus 3 per year that I would expect to see an earthquake that caused more than 60 bridges to be damaged. So this is we call it a proxy performance metric. So it's a metric of the performance of the network, and it's indicating kind of how severe the damage is to the network. But it's a very easy to compute proxy. I don't have to do any network analysis or anything like that. And so we can compute this very quickly. And so we've got this hazard associated with this network performance metric. And then what we're going to do is we'll say, well, there's a range of exceedance rates that are of interest for our decision making here. This would be user specified, but in general, there's going to be some kind of very low impact events that happen very frequently, maybe aren't too relevant for kind of these network risk analysis problems. And then there are going to be some events that are very high in impact, but they're so rare that they're also not very important for us for risk analysis. And those don't need to be specified arbitrarily, but in this case, we're going to look at events that happen somewhere between 10 to the minus 2 and 10 to the minus 4 per year. So that's once every 100 years to once every 10,000 years. And then we'll say, okay, over that exceedance rates of interest, instead of selecting thousands of these simulations, let me select a few dozen simulations and reweight them so that we're reproducing the ground motion hazard curve at a number of sites throughout the region, and we're reproducing this proxy network, proxy performance metric hazard over that exceedance rates of interest. And we may not do well outside because we're not explicitly trying to do that, but we can extend those rates if we need to have a better match, say, in the upper left and the lower right. And this is going to allow us to reselect this smaller set of just a few dozen realizations that still keeps our probabilistic description of the ground motion hazard and the damage to the network, and allows us to continue on with a more expensive network calculation. Okay, now that we're down to just a few dozen realizations of this network performance, we can head into a more detailed network analysis. So let me give you a few highlights of this aspect, stage of the analysis, and again, note a reference down below for those of you looking for more details. So we're going to look at this network state 1 week after the earthquake, considering the severely damaged bridges as still being severely damaged and having a reduced ability to carry traffic or allow traffic underneath overpasses. So what we do is we're using a transit model for the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. It's an agent-based model, so the users of the network are represented by agents that have preferences for where they'd like to travel to, and they're going to alter that behavior or maybe forego trips depending on the congestion on the network. And when we analyze this network model, it takes on the order of 6 hours or more to analyze the network behavior. And so this is the reason why we couldn't come into this problem with thousands of simulations. And the 6+ hours is even on a high performance computer, so we're not able to kind of work our way around this easily just by throwing bigger computing power at it. But with a few dozen realizations of damage to the network we can get ourselves through this network modeling for each of the realizations. Okay, so just a couple highlights is that we're going to head into the network. We're going to reduce the flow capacity on these damaged bridges, and then we're going to look at travel demand. This is using the CT ramp software. So based on the agent's travel preferences, we'll figure out what they want to do given the state of the network. And then trip assignment to get from origins to destinations is going to happen via cube. And we're going to work through this process in 3 iterations of iteratively reducing the flow capacity. The idea being that if we just shut off the capacity on the link, we have instability problems with this analysis, but if we kind of iteratively reduce it down to 0 capacity on damaged links, then we're able to get there in a stable way via this iterative solution. This is also somewhat representative reality. If we're looking 1 week after the earthquake, users do have a chance to kind of learn about the state of the network over time before they're making stable trip assignments and things like that. So we'll take 3 iterations to reduce the flow capacity down to its target, and then after we're done with that, we'll take 3 more iterations to let the travel demand and trip assignment stabilize, and then we'll grab the data out of the back of it for analysis. And this is the type of thing we'll get out of it. I'll show you a few example results so we can see percent increases in travel time per link. We can see changes in the number of trips made. So these are trips across different regions of the network, with coloring indicating kind of the degree of decreases in trips due to disruption on the network. Here's another plot. This is for the 9 counties in the San Francisco Bay Area. What is the percent change in trips out of each county? So you can see there's kind of differential geographic impacts. I won't worry about these too much, but just mention them for completeness. Now, what's more interesting for us in this analysis is to actually try to measure user impacts through something more stable. So each user of this network has a set of transportation choices, and they're associated with a mode and a destination. So a mode is saying that the user could drive, they could take a bus, they could take a train, they could ride their bike, and they have destinations they'd like to get to. So maybe they need to go to work, maybe they'd like to go shopping, they'd like to go on some leisure trip, and they're going to have preferences associated with that. And so for each combination of a mode and a destination, the user is going to have a utility associated with it, and these utilities are calibrated from survey data that the Metropolitan Transportation Commission has collected. Okay, and then I guess a couple other notes. Depending on when the user travels, that'll affect their utility. So they have times a day they'd prefer to travel, but they would move to a different time if the traffic is better, or the travel times are less. And a user may just choose to forego a trip if the utility gets low enough. And then there's a metric that's going to aggregate this all up called a mode destination accessibility. And it's a functional combination of these utilities associated with all modes and all destinations. And so this A value on the end, on the left-hand side, is going to be the accessibility associated with a particular user. Okay. So each user in the network, as the network gets disrupted, their accessibility is going to be impacted, and we're going to compute that and then study what happened due to this network damage. So here's a few notes. On the right, we can look at kind of overall these potential earthquake scenarios and their probabilities of occurrence. Here's an expectation of utility decrease for users, and this is aggregated geographically. This is by travel analysis zone. We can also aggregate by income class and aggregate by the ratio of cars to people who work in a household. So you can look at households with a lot of cars per working people or households with fewer cars. So the latter two, the income class and the ratio of cars to people who work, these are of interest to the Metropolitan Transportation Commission as they look at issues of equity in the population's ability to utilize this transportation network in an effective way. And so we can segment by a geographic region and a demographic classification and look at kind of how users are impacted. So on the right, we see there's spatial impacts just by variations in this color shading here. We see some impacts by income class and things as well, but the geographic variations seem to be stronger in our analysis to date. So I'm going to highlight that in our discussion moving forward here. Okay, so we've made it through all our steps in our analysis. Just to recap, let's look at these 4 panels again. So the step 1, we were simulating earthquake ground motion. Step 2, we used those ground motions to simulate bridge damage using those fragility functions. Then we reduced our set of simulations between step 2 and step 3. For our remaining simulations, we looked at network analysis and computer travel time increases, and then we used that state of that network to compute this user accessibility, which was measuring the ability of users to take the trips that they would like to take, even as after the network is damaged after an earthquake. Okay, so we've now walked all the way through this process, and we can take a look at some of the results for this San Francisco Bay Area example network. So let me talk for a few minutes about 3 specific communities. This is some analysis that's discussed in greater detail in the reference noted at the bottom right. So here's the San Francisco Bay Area again. These thin black lines are indicating travel analysis zones, and we're going to pull out 3 particular ones. So Pacifica is a coastal community down in the at the far west side of the region. San Francisco Financial District is right in the central business district of San Francisco. And then Danville is a community out in the East Bay to the east of the San Francisco Bay. So over on the right, we've got plotted, this is this expected accessibility decrease that we were just defining a few slides ago, and it's plotted versus annual exceedance rates. So for, let's take the all TAZs line to get started. So if we take all TAZs and for each earthquake simulation, we compute the expected accessibility decrease for all users of the network, we get this black line. So with 0.025 per year rate, so once every 40 years or so, we're going to see some impact on the network that's kind of non-trivial due to an earthquake. And then with 0.005 per year, let's say, you see on the order of 0.3 utils of decrease for the average user of the network due to earthquake impacts. So you can kind of get a sense of the range of impacts. Now these 3 specific communities are also plotted here, and we see that the San Francisco Financial District has a lot lower risk than the overall network, so that we actually never see greater than 0.1 utils decrease in accessibility for the San Francisco Financial District over these range of annual exceedance rates. Whereas Pacifica and Danville quite frequently see larger impacts, significantly larger on the order of 0.8 utils decrease with these lower annual exceedance rates. So we wanted to take a look and understand what's different about these communities that gives them such different risk in this network. And so one thing, so certainly I guess I should note that these regions are kind of representative in terms of the spatial variation in accessibility decrease. So Danville is over in this red area where we have greater accessibility impacts. Pacifica has greater accessibility impacts. San Francisco Financial District doesn't have those levels of accessibility impacts. Okay, so let's look at a couple explanations. So Danville, that was the East Bay Area region, and we believe that it fares poorly because the residents tend to commute long distances. So the people living over in the East Bay are frequently commuting west to the job centers in Oakland and San Francisco and San Jose. And so what this means is that there's a lot of circumstances in which that commute can be disrupted by network damage. So to illustrate, we have in the top row 3 plots of earthquake scenarios. So they're in black lines are shown the extent of the ruptures associated with the Hayward and San Andreas being the kind of the well-known and well-anticipated earthquake events, and then a further East Bay event on the Great Valley Fault as well, just to illustrate. And what's interesting is that on this magnitude 6.9 Hayward event, we see a lot of bridge damage in the Oakland area, the East Bay area, and we see a lot in the lower row of figures, a lot of accessibility loss for these East Bay residents, as would be expected. But interestingly, when there's a San Andreas fault over on the peninsula on the western part of the bay, we see a lot of damage in the peninsula as well, a significant number of damaged bridges in the East Bay, and we still see a lot of dark red regions in the East Bay, reflecting the impact of those East Bay residents as they're perhaps trying to commute across the bay, seeing impacts from the loss of the ability to utilize that transportation network for those circumstances. So the fact that the San Andreas event still impacts East Bay residents significantly was a little bit surprising to us, but we felt was plausible after looking into the analysis in greater depth, greater detail. Let's take a look at Pacifica. So Pacifica is out to the west. They don't have to necessarily cross over the bay to get to job centers, but they do have a limited number of roads. This community has a limited number of roads to get to other portions of the network. So if we zoom in on the right panel here, we have Pacifica, and it's connected by only Highway 1, heading to the north up towards San Francisco, and then heading to the south to roads crossing over the Santa Cruz Mountains and on further south. And so if this Highway 1 is disrupted, Pacifica is quite sensitive to that and not having additional alternate routes for transportation. Okay, and then finally, San Francisco, that was the area that had very little accessibility impacts relative to most other parts of the network. And if we take a look here at this plot, this is a plot of each circle here indicates one of those travel analysis zones. And each travel analysis zone, we have an expected decrease in accessibility on the y-axis, and then the percentage of trips taken by foot on the x-axis. So San Francisco, this travel analysis zone, the financial district, had extremely high percentage of trips taken by foot relative to some of the more suburban communities. And so it's going to be less vulnerable to disruption of the transit network as needing to travel great distances, or also being less susceptible to traffic congestion when the network is damaged. And so if we take those off, that fits with an overall trend of the travel analysis zones with high percentage of trips by foot having relatively low decreases in accessibility. So again, that's relatively intuitive once we've dug into the data a little bit. Okay, so this local resolution, we were interested in this and interested in looking at these specific communities to understand the various impacts that they would face. But when we talked to decision makers, we heard a lot that the local resolution was important for understanding equity. I touched on this earlier, but not all regions of this, it's not just an aggregate measure of the network performance that's of interest to decision makers, and we're treating kind of all regions equally. But there are things like communities of concern. This is a figure from Plan Bay Area, a planning effort, noting specific communities of concern where there's reasons of kind of equity or demographics where there's a special focus on making sure that those communities are being equitably served by the transportation resources. And so overlaying these communities of concern with the areas of disproportionate impact can identify, are there regions of facing inappropriate levels of risk from seismic damage that could be addressed through retrofit or other types of mitigation actions. The other thing that happens all the time is planning of retrofit or upgrading of the network. Here's another figure on the right from Plan Bay Area, noting with these numbered icons places where upgrades of the transit system are already planned. These are ongoing. They've already happened significantly for seismic retrofits over the past few decades in California. And when we're thinking about seismic retrofits, qualitatively the things that are thought about are, we want to think about network components that are vulnerable. So decreasing that vulnerability is important. We also want to think about network components that are on highly trafficked routes. So it's the highly trafficked routes where there's the most importance of making sure that they're serviceable or usable after an earthquake. And situations where there's limited alternative routes would make a component more important if there's not going to be alternative routes anticipated to be available after an earthquake. So currently what's done is those types of factors and others are considered in the scoring system for prioritization, and you just add points associated, when there's features of a component that are important for these types of decision making, and then that scoring system is used to rank components for upgrade. And our question here was, if we're going to do this full risk analysis, can we more directly measure the component's importance to the network just directly out of this type of analysis, rather than having to do some sort of a heuristic scoring system? And so let me tell you just for a couple minutes about this thinking. This is some ongoing work. So an option that's available today is to say, let's retrofit a bridge if the expected repair costs given a 475-year return period earthquake ground motion were to occur. So you use the 475-year return period ground motion, you use a fragility analysis like the one we're using here, or some sort of another analysis, predict damage and predict how expensive that would be to repair, and then you could go repair the bridges where you're anticipating high repair costs after an earthquake. So this is the metric that's used by Caltrans today. It does think about bridges with high hazard, so the bridges that are close to faults are going to have higher ground motions they're exposed to. And it also identifies bridges with high vulnerability, because the bridges that are vulnerable that aren't going to anticipated to perform well, they're going to have higher repair costs. So you're catching the impact of the ground motion hazard and the vulnerability. There's no sort of network effects or measure of the importance of the bridge, though, with this type of system. And just for some quick comparisons, we have plotted here on the right kind of a score for these bridges based on this type of metric. So the bridges noted in red dots are kind of the highest priority bridges via this metric, so they have the highest expected repair costs under a 475-year ground motion, down to the white bridges being the lowest priority with the lowest expected costs. Okay. Another option that would be easy in place today is to just identify the bridges with the highest daily traffic on them. So that'll be the most important bridges, but it doesn't capture the vulnerability of the bridge or the hazard that it's exposed to. And it doesn't also account for redundant routes. So this is highest traffic under an undamaged circumstance, but traffic patterns are going to change when we see damage in an earthquake. So capturing that is a little bit non-trivial with this type of approach. But that's another example. So you could see if we use this metric, you see on these kind of north-south highway corridors, lots of red bridges. Those are the big interstate highways with lots of traffic on them on a daily basis. Okay, and then a third approach which we considered and which Mihaly and Miller proposed in their thesis was to say, why don't we retrofit the bridges whose damage is frequently associated with high levels of network disruption? So we'll take all those network disruption simulations that we were discussing in the 5 slides ago or so, and we'll look at the simulations where there was the highest network disruption, and we'll identify the bridges that were damaged in those high disruption scenarios. And if we look at the suite of the highest disruption scenarios and a bridge keeps showing up as damaged in those, then that's indicative that that bridge's damage is problematic with regard to the network performance. So there's no sort of model that's relating the bridge damage to the network performance. So you can capture nonlinearities, you can capture the impacts of co-occurring bridge damage. This is similar to the frequent item set analysis that's used in machine learning sometimes. And so we thought that was a good motivation for this type of thinking. So we can see a plot over on the right of the high targeted bridges using this approach. So this is a lot of the bridges in that Oakland East Bay area. Those are the areas where we kept seeing the red regions and the accessibility loss figures earlier. So that makes sense. We'd want to be retrofitting bridges in the areas that are seeing those big impacts. I'll note here that this figure on the right was produced using average regional accessibility decrease as the network disruption metric, but you could use other disruption metrics with this approach, and that would alter the decisions you were making. So you could use a kind of a local disruption measure, say, in this community, when I see high levels of disruption, which bridges are being damaged in those types of simulations? Or if I took all of the communities of interest from a few slides ago and looked at kind of high impacts there, which bridges are being damaged in the situations where those communities are experiencing disruption to the network or loss of accessibility. So you can tailor your disruption measure to target kind of the retrofit strategy you'd like to utilize. Okay, so this is work in progress, but it's one concept that we're continuing to explore in our group, thinking about this retrofit prioritization using network level risk assessment. A final note with that is we can use this prioritization approach not only to target retrofits, but also to target refinement of the fragilities for the bridges. So I noted earlier that we had this relatively crude model for bridge damage just using those hazardous fragility functions. But if we knew from an analysis like this where are the top few % of bridges in terms of importance to the network risk, then we could go back and do a targeted refinement of those fragility functions with some more detailed analysis. And we could not waste a lot of time trying to refine analysis of bridges that are relatively well performing or relatively unimportant for network level risk. So that's the benefit of this type of approach, is this targeted refinement that it would facilitate. Okay, so to start wrapping up, I'll pull up this 4-panel plot again. So these are the different stages of analysis that we went through. A lot of this we tried to take some of those stages of analysis off the shelf and piece them together. There's some specific areas where we tried to make contributions, and I'll just highlight that to make clear kind of where our group is working relative to this overall story that I told you. So over in this first panel, we've done a lot of work here in characterizing these ground shaking intensities. In particular, we've done a lot of work over the years calibrating spatial correlation models, measuring the kind of spatial variability in ground shaking intensity, and then demonstrating the impacts of that on assessments like this. Also, when we took those thousands of simulations of ground shaking intensity and optimized them down to just a few dozen sets, that's an area where we've done some work in trying to develop those optimization strategies, and also trying to just efficiently simulate those ground motion maps to begin with is another area where we've done a lot of work. Okay, the bridge damage models we've taken off the shelf. The network modeling, we've taken that off the shelf from collaborators. Where we've made contributions over on the right side is to take those transit models, network performance models, and try to utilize them in the assessment of earthquake risk in a probabilistic manner. So adopting those network models to be functional under levels of severe disruption due to bridge damage, taking those models and using them in a probabilistic way over kind of uncertain future earthquake damage. And then utilizing those models and these accessibility decrease metrics to prioritize retrofits and think about retrofit strategies and other decision support. That's another area where we've been making contributions. Okay, so to start concluding, I'll note that when we want to think about bridge impacts and impacts of bridge damage, I think that it's most usefully thought about in a broad perspective. So rather than just thinking about how damaged will this bridge be under a given earthquake scenario, we'd like to back up a bit and say, well, let's model geohazards generally, in this case earthquakes, and specifically earthquake shaking, but we can broaden that out a little bit. Utilizing that model for those geohazards, we can then predict damage to the structures, but we don't want to stop there. Let's take that damage to the structures, push it into an analysis of network performance, and say how do those structures, being damaged influence network performance, and that ultimately influences the humans that try to use that network. And then a slight complication here is that the way that the humans interact with that network obviously influences the way that the network is seen to perform. So the behavior of users foregoing trips or rerouting is going to impact how we view whether the network is performing its, the duties that we're hoping it to perform. So that kind of end-to-end picture gives us additional insights into that analysis. Then as we look at network performance, I think it's also informative to not just think about network-wide metrics and how many hours are lost in traffic congestion, but to look at individual communities. So we heard that from decision makers and transportation agencies again and again, that it's kind of individual communities or individual demographics within a community that are of interest when thinking about decision making for upgrading networks. And so if we want to, as engineers, be addressing the needs of these decision makers, we need to think about individual communities. And I hope we've demonstrated here today that that's a feasible calculation through this type of example that we've shown you. And then finally, this thinking that we were talking about right in the last few slides is that when we think about identifying critical components, for example, to think about components that should be retrofit in order to enhance network performance, we need to think about how that component affects the user impacts. Not just is that component likely to be damaged or how expensive would it be to repair that component, but how do the users of the network ultimately, how are they influenced by the potential for that component to be damaged and the component as well as other components in the network to be damaged. And that's a complicated thing to assess, but again, with all of these bullet points, I hope we've achieved today kind of showing you that these are types of questions that are feasible to answer without spending millions of dollars and many years to do the analysis. Okay, so that gave you a flavor a little bit of what we've been thinking about with seismic network risk assessment. To close, I'll point you to a couple resources. So our group's research website that's noted there has an additional number of publications on this topic, including the ones that were referenced throughout this presentation. And additionally, there's some software tools that are available there to facilitate this type of analysis. And then I'll point you to Mahalia Miller's PhD thesis from a couple of years ago. So she dug into great detail into most of the topics that were presented here. And so that's also an excellent place to look for those of you who are interested in further information on these topics. So with that, I'll close. I hope this has been an informative use of your time to watch this presentation. And again, I'll point you to these resources for interested viewers looking for additional information on these topics. Thank you.